Hello everyone, welcome to Astrologer Climate Witness. Today I'm going to be reading an article from resilience.org first. It has to do with collapse. And then I have this very interesting article that I found in Mountain Astrologer. I'm so sad this magazine is out of print now. They shut down. And then a little bit from uh, Overshoot. Okay, so we have a lot to do today. It's not short, I don't think. Uh, Now, one of my focuses today is on the idea or concept of a paradigm. And that's what I focus on a little bit more than most other people when it comes to astrology, because I follow more and do a lot of more philosophical work with the outer planets, astrological work, etc. So, what I'm going to start with is this article from resilience.org, Racing Toward Collapse: How Our Fear of Limits Drives Us Off a Cliff. Technological fundamentalism is everywhere, but we rarely call it by its name. It's that unquestioned belief that no matter what crisis we face, be it climate change, resource depletion, or society falling apart, technology will swoop in and save the day. It's the strong belief that limits don't really exist, that human ingenuity can always outmaneuver reality, and that slowing down, pausing, or reconsidering the direction we're heading is an act of heresy. Europe must keep pace, declares politician after politician, echoing in white papers and tech forums alike. This is a phrase repeated endlessly these days, but keep pace with what exactly? A society that demands perpetual acceleration, no matter the cost, with an arms race of technological development that serves its own momentum rather than human well-being, with market forces that know no boundaries other than the next quarter's profits. The race itself is the problem. This isn't just a flaw in policy. It's baked into how we measure success, design incentives, and tell stories about our progress. We are so fixated on keeping up that we forget to ask where exactly we are going. That is the name of this video. Our species doesn't know what it's doing, and it doesn't know where we're going. You know, we astrologers think about the unknown, like the future. Basically, it really is a black hole. We work on past knowledge and the symbolism of astrology to see what we can deduce about the future from past experiences and past events. And we do okay. But in general, we're kind of missing a more we've allowed the culture to condition ourselves too in regard to that idea that humans are always going to win, that our species is always going to be successful, because we have been for a very long time. But now we are hitting a wall. Okay, let me continue reading. And when someone dares to suggest we should slow down or even stop for a moment to reconsider, they are met with alarm. This fear of limits runs deep. To acknowledge that there might be constraints on growth, on energy, on the capacity of the planet to sustain us is to shatter a fundamental modern illusion. The way we've structured our societies depends on the assumption that progress is infinite, and that there is always a way forward, that if we just innovate hard enough, no problem will be impossible to overcome. So, this is not a neutral worldview. It is an ideology, a faith In technology, salvation, so to speak, technological salvation. It is an ideology, a faith in technological salvation so deeply ingrained that we barely recognize it for what it is. And yet, history offers no examples of infinite solutions. Every civilization that ignored ecological limits paid the price. The Mayans, once rulers of vast city-states, collapsed after deforestation and drought drained their agricultural capacity. The people of Easter Island, in their pursuit of progress, felled the very trees that sustained them, sealing their fate. The Norse settlements in Greenland perished as they clung to the unsustainable European farming practices rather than adapting to their environment. The natural world is governed by constraints, and so are we, whether we acknowledge them or not. Strangely enough, we readily accept limits in most areas of life. We don't expect a tree to grow to the sky, a single cow to produce infinite milk, or a human body to run without sleep. We design airplanes according to the laws of physics, not wishful thinking. We acknowledge biological limits in medicine, but when it comes to growth, technology, and consumption, we tell ourselves that the limits are an illusion. This contradiction is absurd, and yet it governs how we approach the most pressing crises of our time. Climate change, technology will fix it. Energy shortages, innovation is always just around the corner. Social collapse, surely AI will manage it. Even when there is no evidence that these solutions will arrive in time, or at all, we double down. The mere suggestion that we should reduce consumption, restructure our economies, or embrace a slower pace of life is met with hostility. To say that we cannot sustain infinite growth is treated as radical. But what exactly is radical about acknowledging reality? The biggest irony is that technological fundamentalism disguises itself as rationality. It presents itself as a paradigm, forward thinking, the only reasonable stance. Meanwhile, those who argue for caution, for recognizing limits, for designing a world that operates within planetary boundaries, are dismissed as naive and defeatist. But look around. Who is really being irrational? The person who suggests we adapt to the world as it is, or the one who insists we can keep sprinting toward collapse because something else will eventually save us. The most common response to these concerns is a casual shrug. We'll figure it out, or worse, the market will take care of it. But how does one come to such a conclusion with certainty? Where is the evidence that innovation will always arrive just in time, precisely when we need it? This is faith, not reason, and it's an incredibly dangerous gamble. To be clear, this is not an argument against technology itself. Okay? The wheel, the printing press, vaccines, renewable energy, human innovation has brought extraordinary progress, but not all technology is good technology. You figure. What comes to mind? Nuclear power plants. A decentralized solar grid that empowers local communities is not the same as AI systems optimizing hedge fund profits at planetary cost. The question is whether we should innovate, but why, how, and for whom? What if we innovated to slow down rather than speed up? What if our goal was not productivity, but sufficiency? Not extraction, but regeneration. Are we creating solutions that actually improve human well-being, or are we just inventing ways to sustain an unsustainable system a little longer? Even if these innovations were meaningful, we must also ask, who pays the price for them and who benefits? The minerals that fuel our digital optimism, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, are not extracted in a vacuum. They come at a cost, and that cost is often borne by communities far from Silicon Valley or Brussels. The same technologies we hope will save us are built on extractive practices that echo old colonial patterns, environmental degradation in the global south, so the north can maintain the illusion of clean progress. For many, collapse is not a distant threat. It is a present reality. Ignoring limits does not make them disappear. The belief that we can expand infinitely, consume endlessly, and outthink nature itself has no scientific basis. In fact, each crisis we face seems to trigger a cycle of doubling down. More climate chaos? Invest in geoengineering. Economic instability? Push for AI driven efficiency. Social unrest? Deploy surveillance tools. But these responses rarely address the root cause. They deepen the same habits that led us here in the first place. We are patching a sinking ship with faster engines. What does have a basis in reality is the trajectory we are on: rising temperatures, collapsing biodiversity, resource depletion, and social instability. If we continue at this pace, collapse is not a distant possibility, it is a certainty. Well, it is a certainty, trust me. And collapse may not look like a Hollywood apocalypse, but like water rationing, food price spikes, rising authoritarianism, and fraying social trust. That's a biggie. Fraying social trust. The real unknown is whether the technological solutions we are waiting for will arrive in time. And if they don't, what then? This is the fundamental question that technological fundamentalism refuses to ask. It is a belief system that bets everything on the unknown. It's like somebody looking at the chart and seeing Jupiter's going to trine their sun, and Uranus is going to conjunct its natal Jupiter, and all this great stuff is going to happen because it's all happening up at the 10th house, and Venus is in trine to it's progressed. Venus is in trine to natal sun. I don't know, things along those lines. So you think, oh wow, my life is really going to be perfect in another half a year. It's like you have to consider everything. Consider the environment that you're in. Yes, those things might be taking place and they might help you. But if you're not considering the environment that you're in and what's happening around you, it could look very different from what you think it's going to be. Okay, where was I? This is the fundamental question that technological fundamentalism refuses to ask. Okay, I said that. It's not hard to see why we cling to these beliefs. The idea that technology will save us offers comfort in a disoriented world. It tells us we don't have to change our lives, our economies, our values. It lets us imagine we can solve planetary crisis without confronting power or privilege. But comfort is not a substitute for truth. The longer we hide behind the fantasy of inevitable innovation, the harder the landing becomes. If there is one lesson history teaches us, it is that those who acknowledge limits survive. Those who ignore them do not. The choice before us is simple. Adapt to reality or continue chasing a fantasy until it falls apart. If we are serious about survival, not just as individuals, but as a species, it is time to start designing a world that does not rely on miracles, no matter how emotionally comforting they may be. And we can do that with astrology sometimes too. We want to take comfort from certain things that we see in our chart and another person's chart. And to some degree, that can be helpful. If somebody's going through a really hard time, you want to look for help and support in some ways. But to do that and at the same time ignore the realities that are going on is not helpful. Okay, so the reason I'm focusing on paradigms, again, is, you know me, Pluto and Aquarius, okay? And I'm talking about our species. So one thing I keep leaving out every time I talk about Pluto and Aquarius, I've been wanting to describe it in this way. Anybody familiar with the Unitarian Church? I don't go, okay, but if I did, that would probably be someplace that would be interesting for me to attend. So anyway, if you ever, there used to be one in a neighborhood I lived in, and the stained glass window was really interesting. And I was studying astrology back then. The stained glass window had the four corners of that window had pictures painted. And the first one was the bull. The second one was the lion. The third one was the eagle, and the fourth was man. So I don't know how many of you have followed certain writers who describe Aquarius as the first sign that depicts man as its representative. Okay. You know, you've got Virgo sometimes. Sometimes you'll see the maiden virgin with sheaves of wheat, but most of the time you just see the sheaves of wheat. Okay. But, and you know, in general, I suppose that's okay. But Aquarius, there's no animal necessarily, except us, that would be represented by Aquarius. So, yes, it is our sign, and Pluto is there. Now, am I saying that our species can transform Pluto quick enough to save us? Not necessarily, because there's going to be a massive loss of life. Like I said before, if you look up the term bottleneck, the scientific term for bottleneck, that's what we're headed toward. This century, towards the end. But don't worry, that doesn't happen all at once. That's what everybody has in mind when you say these things. It's a process throughout these next decades, okay? Okay, now, let me read this article, which I think is really interesting. I can't believe I found this. When I've thought of using paradigm as the focus, Pluto through Aquarius, the paradigm of even, this is my thing, even though we can't maybe necessarily save ourselves, what we can try to do, and it will help us, and maybe, I mean, we'll still lose people, but is transform our species as best we can to save other species, to save various bushes and trees and flowers and possums, and I know they're really ugly, but, and to save as much habitat for these animals, and in the meantime saving habitat for ourselves. That's the point. Okay, Pluto and Aquarius. Okay, all right, here we go. Astrological paradigms, how our worldview affects our approach to astrology and to the world, and how we treat it. Given that I have Jupiter and Sagittarius in the 8th house, it should be no wonder that I have an interest in paradigms and how our thoughts and perceptions are integrated through them. Hopefully, my interest is accompanied by insight worthy of my Scorpio, Mercury, and 4th house Pluto. And this is written by Gargatholil. Gargatholil. Okay. Oh, my poor kitty's trying to come in the house, but it's really nice out. She doesn't need to come in. She's poking on the screen. Okay. What is a paradigm? A paradigm is a worldview that is widely shared and around which a set of beliefs exist. And in here, William Cattons describes a paradigm of the age of exuberance, and I've read that in the past in one of my videos, and that's how we looked at the world for the very longest time, especially when we first came to the Americas, because everything was new. There were people here, but you know, we were blind, you know, but it was like, because Europe had gotten crowded, so we came here, and then, you know, we were so exuberant, you know, and that whole idea of manifest destiny and all that crap. Okay, here we go. I'll stop that again. Oh, she's crying. Okay, hold on a second. Come on, you little fucker. Okay. She's a sweetie. She's my girl, my little girl. Because mine are all grown up and they moved. Okay, here we go. Where was I? I'll start again here. What is a paradigm? A paradigm is a worldview that is widely shared and around which a set of beliefs exist. The idea of the paradigm as a governing model was introduced in the early 1960s by Thomas S. Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Kuhn saw the paradigm as a model for the view of how the world works that is agreed upon by science at any particular time. It determines how science is pursued and what is or is not theoretically or, in parentheses, even factually acceptable. In Jupiterian fashion, we can generalize this concept of the paradigm to apply more broadly to how consciousness is organized to experience reality. In fact, the concept of a paradigm shares much with Jupiter, the ninth house, and Sagittarius astrological themes. A paradigm can be seen as a global worldview, global in the sense that it encompasses everything. At one level, it is formed through our assimilation of varied encounters we have with the world, both externally and internally. At another level, once formed or adopted, it is that model of reality through which everything else is integrated. In a sense, all of our dealings, perceptions, thoughts, and everything that we believe can be seen as proceeding from the paradigm we hold. Paradigms cannot be proven. They are priori. The given, all right, now I downloaded for some people, I remember that term from my statistics and my astrology. I here's an AI definition of a priori. Here we go. A priori means knowledge or a conclusion derived through reason and logic rather than from observation or experience. It's essentially from the previous, that's in quotes, from the previous, or from first principles, implying that the knowledge or conclusion is established beforehand. In contrast, a posteriori knowledge is derived from experience or observation. Here's a more detailed breakdown. Latin origin. A priori is a Latin term that literally translates to from what is earlier, or from what comes first. Deductive reasoning. A priori reasoning often involves deductive reasoning, which means starting with general principles and applying them to specific situations to reach a conclusion. Doesn't that sound a little like astrology? Yes. Examples. Assuming a road will be wet after it stops raining, based on a priori knowledge of how water behaves, a mathematical knowing 2 plus 2 equals 4 before any observations or experiment. A priori knowledge can also be used in legal legal based on priori knowledge or how water behaves. Oh, what happened? What happened? A mathematical, I read that. Okay. Oh, here it is. Legal arguments like determining the potential impact of a tax before it's implemented. Contrast with a posteriori. A posteriori reasoning, on the other hand, is based on empirical evidence and observation. For example, concluding that a car is red after seeing it, or determining the effect of a drug based on observing its impact on test subjects. So you've got all the data from the experiment, and then you come up with your reasoning or your thoughts on the matter. Okay, so there's that. Okay, your conclusion. That's what I was trying to think of. Okay, here we go. Okay, they are a priori, the given that is fundamental to our belief systems. We take our paradigms on faith and Sagittarius fashion. We assume that the paradigm we hold represents the truth. Most of the time, we are not even conscious of the paradigm we have adopted because the worldview that it represents seems self-evident to us. How do we acquire our paradigms in the first place? Of course, our worldview is initially formulated through the conditioning we receive from our family of origin in parentheses, Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. Besides this conditioning, there are two main instruments through which paradigms are more formally conveyed, both associated with the ninth house, religion, and education. As an example of how deeply religion creates and influences our worldview, we can look to the Judeo-Christian Islamic Orthodox concept of a God who is separate from his creation and who rules his creation as it does a king. I will not enumerate all of the influences that have proceeded from this assumption, but we can note that even the most secular aspects of Western thought and civilization have been dominated by the idea of humanity as an independent and separate entity distinct from nature and the cosmos. We take our paradigms. Oh, I read that. It was just a little excerpt they have there. Okay. With respect to education, the scientific and philosophical paradigms may be formulated and most active in the realm of academia, ninth house, and their transmission to the society's elites and primarily conducted at that level. However, the influence of higher education paradigmatic thought reaches down into the lower levels of educational institutions, even to the traditionally third house domain of primary education. What do paradigms have to do with astrology? We have already suggested that paradigms affect virtually every aspect of our life and thought, and this includes how we approach astrology. One difference between astrological paradigms and scientific paradigms is that in the scientific community, there tends to be almost universal agreement on or sharing in the dominant paradigm, except during a paradigm shift, in which case we see two camps, one supporting the old orthodox paradigm and the other supporting the new revolutionizing paradigm. So that's really important because we just got rid of to me, Pluto has a lot to do with paradigms. They might get to that because I've read that before in the past. One difference between astrological paradigms and scientific paradigms is that in scientific community, there tends to be almost universal agreement on or sharing in the dominant paradigm, except during a paradigm shift, in which case we see two camps, one supporting the old orthodox paradigm and the other supporting the new revolutionizing paradigm. In astrology, however, we see the coexistence of multiple paradigms, none of which achieves dominance. I have identified 4 such paradigms. There could be more. These I term the scientific, deterministic, New Age, and metaphysical paradigms. As will become evident, these paradigms are not mutually exclusive, although one paradigm is usually dominant within the practice of any particular astrologer or group of astrologers. There is some truth in each of the paradigms. Therefore, it is natural that we might adopt or concede some aspects of a paradigm to which we do not fully subscribe. Readers should be aware that the summaries below take a broad strokes. Few of these paradigms Readers should be aware that the summaries below take a broad strokes view of these paradigms. Space does not allow for a more nuanced discussion of the subtleties, variations, and even disagreements that exist within every approach to astrology. Scientific paradigm. Astrologers whose work is influenced by the scientific paradigm hold the belief that astrology is a science, in the sense that astrology is a body of knowledge that describes an objective reality. While we may not be able to understand why astrology works, the scientific astrologer believes that astrology works through a set of rules that correspond in some way to cause and effect. I'm not saying that the scientific astrologer believes that the planets and their motives cause events on Earth to happen. However, the scientific astrologer paradigm assumes that if we have enough knowledge of the rules by which astrological cause and effect operate, we can make predictions with a fair degree of certainty. This fair degree of certainty may range from a belief that specific events can be predicted, akin to Newtonian scientific paradigm, which we must remember actually works with 99% of our experienced reality, to a belief that astrology can confidently make predictions within a field of probability akin to the quantum mechanics scientific paradigm. The scientific paradigm also governs how astrologers gain knowledge of the rules of astrology. A key feature of the scientific approach is collecting data and conducting experiments. Thus, astrologers who adopt the scientific paradigm will look for patterns in the data correlating astrological configurations and events with conditions and events that occur in the real world. The availability of troves of astrological charts and the massive computing power that allows the rapid analysis of this data have been a godsend to the scientific astrologer. Also, knowledge gained by astrological forebears, very important, is not ignored by the scientific astrologer, who will mine this data as well, as long as it can be shown to be valid. The scientific astrologer will constantly verify the theories suggested by the data, both ancient and recent, by testing them on their clients. Of course, we are all scientists in the sense that we favor those techniques that result in a successful outcome. The Gonquilans and Stephen Arroyo were early champions of the scientific astrological paradigm, advocating astrological interpretations based on empirical research. We also see this paradigm active in mundane astrology, which is what I'm doing here, mostly. Richard Tarnas Tarnas's work shows us that the scientific approach is perfectly compatible with the belief in alternative states of consciousness, as demonstrated by his work with Stanislav Grof. Never heard of that guy. The deterministic paradigm. While determinism may be quite out of fashion in some astrological circles, well, it's not in some scientific circles. I gotta think of that guy's name. I've read his stuff here. It is still a paradigm that holds tremendous sway. Determinism runs counter to a very strong belief held in Western culture, that we have free will. In fact, most Western deterministic astrologers will maintain that we do have free will, despite the implications of the paradigm under which they operate. Now I'm going to read that paragraph again because it's really important. While determinism may be quite out of fashion in some astrological circles, it is still a paradigm that holds tremendous sway. Determinism runs counter to a very strong belief held in Western culture that we have free will. In fact, most Western deterministic astrologers will maintain that we do have free will, despite the implications of the paradigm under which they operate. The deterministic astrological paradigm presumes that prediction is possible because the events of our lives are already predetermined. It is the task of the astrologer to discover the individual's fate by interpreting the astrological symbols. We can look to the origins of the deterministic astrological paradigm in two worlds, the Vedic and the classical. Vedic astrology is governed by the Hindu belief in karma, though this belief is not confined to Hindu thought. Karmas, as we experience them in this life, are the results of actions that we have performed in the past lives for which we must now bear the consequences. Our karmas are allotted to us at birth, and the astrological chart can be viewed as a map or a blueprint of our karmic destiny. In Vedic thought, karmas govern every event and every aspect of our lives. Thus, with certain exceptions, everything can be predicted because of our destiny is fixed. The concept corresponding to karma in the classical world was fate. The concept of fate was less well developed as a moral theory and did not rely upon a belief in reincarnation. However, it was clear that what happened to humans was, for whatever reason, governed by the gods, and particularly by the Moirae, the three sisters who wove the threads of human destiny. Here, too, the astrological chart can be viewed as a tool to divine what the fates have decreed. A special case, or seeming contradiction, is electional astrology, practiced by both Vedic and classical traditions. Electional astrology implies that fate can be changed or determined by performing an action at a correct time. This implies the possibility of our interactions with our fate or karma, that our destiny is not absolutely determined, but that future events can be affected by our choice. Of course, one could argue that the electional cast and the choice to follow it is itself predestined. This is highly restricted free will, however, because the electional choice is constrained to a certain degree, because the electional choice is constrained to a certain question and a certain timing, and the actions taken or not taken at the proper time still determine the course of future events. The influence of Vedic and classical astrology on modern Western astrology can be found in the practice of using transits, progressions, and other techniques to predict future events and circumstances or to explain the necessity of past events. Whether consciously acknowledged or not, the underlying premise behind these predictive techniques is the linkage of the positioning of the astrological symbols to events that will occur and are therefore predetermined. Still, many astrologers in the West, conditioned by the prevailing belief in free will, might qualify this premise in their conscious mind, stating it is to themselves as in more probabilistic terms. This leads to the quantum variant of the deterministic principle. The concept that the astrological chart represents a field of probable events that may occur. This concept, however, does not so much deny the underlying presumption that life events are predetermined, but rather relates to our ability to predict specific outcomes with certainty. The outcome may already be fixed in space and time, but we cannot know that outcome until it occurs. Thus, it appears to us that events occur with some uncertainty, though within a field of possible events limited by their probability. A predominantly Western adaptation of the deterministic astrological paradigm is its application to the description of personality. Personality or individuality is primarily a modern Western concern. The concept here is that the astrological chart determines our personality in that the configuration of the astrological symbol set places what? Let me try that one again. The concept here is that the astrological chart determines our personality in that the configuration of the astrological symbol set places definite boundaries. Symbol set places definite boundaries around our personality characteristics. Thus, we say that Librans are indecisive, people-oriented, and concerned about how they appear to others. While daily horoscope columns may be almost a caricature of this concept, remember that, for those of you that don't necessarily study astrology. The deterministic aspect of the style may be masked somewhat by the offering of a menu of attributes connected with an astrological configuration. But whether it is the writings of Linda Goodman or Robert Hand, the deterministic paradigm is still alive and well in modern astrology. The New Age paradigm. The New Age paradigm stands in contrast to the deterministic paradigm, and perhaps it can be said that the ascendancy of this paradigm is responsible more than anything else for the astrological community's pulling away from acknowledging the deterministic paradigm. The New Age paradigm blends a radical adherence to free will with the belief in the inevitable evolutionary progress of humankind. It has roots in a number of streams of thought. The New Thought positive thinking movement of the late 19th and early century, the psychedelic movement of the 60s, the Hindu concept of the progressive transmigration of souls through the process of reincarnation, and the Buddhist principle of bodhisattva. The New Age paradigm views karma and fate as illusions that bind us to our limitations. Free will can be exercised to create our own reality through right thinking, intention, and visualization, and freeing ourselves of the constraints on our natural innate empowerment. What's more, anyone can do this if they have the will to do so, and if they work to free themselves from the limitations imposed by our minds. Furthermore, with the dawning of the age of Aquarius, all of mankind is moving in this more liberating direction, and ultimately a quantum consciousness leap will bring about a world peace, love, harmony, and spiritual growth. To a large extent, astrologers holding to the New Age paradigm view astrology and its symbols as a vehicle for individual and collective progress toward this new age. Natal positions, transits, and other astrological events may become tools through which we can realize our intentions and grow positively. Each astrological occurrence, whether it be an easy or a challenging configuration, is presented as an opportunity to achieve our desires or to make our reality in order to put us in a better place. Of course, having positive desires is stressed, and there may be emphasis on achieving spiritual growth. But money, love, success, and abundance are also goals that can be realized by pursuing the opportunities opened up for us by a cosmic dance of planets, asteroids, and planetoids included. An astrological school that shares space with the New Age paradigm is the evolutionary astrology. I say shares space because the principles of evolutionary astrology can be applied within other paradigms, particularly the metaphysical paradigm described below. However, evolutionary astrology lends itself to the New Age paradigm, and a great many of its practitioners assume the validity of that paradigm. A key New Age belief is that rather than being subject to our karmas determining our reincarnation into the body, our soul consciously chooses the life we are to be born into in order to maximize our evolutionary potential. Through evolutionary astrology, we can discover our soul's evolutionary intention and the lessons we entered this life to resolve. The direction is always toward higher states of consciousness and freedom unless we choose not to exercise free will in that direction. All right. I know this is a little long, but very, very significant. The metaphysical paradigm. The metaphysical paradigm was a dominant paradigm among the peoples of the Mediterranean basin, Europe, and the Middle East, at least from the time of Pythagoras until it was supplanted by the scientific rational paradigm. The downfall of metaphysical paradigm began with the Renaissance and culminated with the Enlightenment period in the 18th century, although it had been challenged by the scientific rationale paradigm since Aristotle. Held as a discredited worldview by modern science and philosophy, it was reviewed in alternative thought circles when colonialism brought Europeans in touch with Eastern concepts, including Sufism during the 19th century. The fundamental premise of the metaphysical paradigm is a radical monotheism, sometimes labeled as pantheism or monism, which views the entire creation as a manifestation of the one being. Because there is no other existent than the one, the idea of created entities having free will is viewed as an illusion, a cosmic legerdemain. If any free will exists, it is to attune oneself to the divine will. Exponents of the metaphysical paradigm, the Neoplatonists, the Kabbalists, generally conceived of the manifestation of the one into or as the creation to be proceeding or emanating through successively lower stages of consciousness. Through the soul's attunement to the divine will, one's consciousness may rise upward, finally attaining the state of union with the one or returning to the source. Thus, in this rejection of the idea of free will, the metaphysical paradigm is akin to the deterministic paradigm. However, in its focus on raising the soul's consciousness, it has similarities to the New Age paradigm. Another feature of the metaphysical paradigm is its recognition of the human condition as being trapped in the lower realms of consciousness. The human condition can be compared to one who has been tossed down a deep, dark well. The metaphysical problem, therefore, is how to extract oneself from the illusory world of duality with its multiple snares. Unlike adherents to determinism, those operating within the metaphysical paradigm are not concerned with the gains and losses of this world, except as our actions in this world might free us from our entanglements here. For those adopting metaphysical paradigm, astrology may be a tool that is useful for understanding the human condition and extracting ourselves from that condition. Consistent with the theosophical beliefs, Galileo maintained that the horoscope becomes less relevant the higher the consciousness is raised, for the limitations of character and form, of time and space dissolve at those levels. Thus, the focus of astrology operating within the metaphysical paradigm is on the psychological dimensions of the human condition, and particularly in understanding how the ego can become entrapped and how it can be liberated. Under the metaphysical astrological paradigms, there tends to be less emphasis on the personal planets, Sun through Jupiter, and more emphasis on the transformative planets, beginning with Saturn and on through Pluto, as Liz Green has demonstrated. The metaphysical paradigm highlights understanding oneself and doing the work of transforming the ego consciousness on an individual level. Thereby, this paradigm overlaps the New Age approach to achieving greater enlightenment, but its focus is strictly on the individual, and it does not foresee the coming of a collective golden age on Earth. Conclusion. We have explored four modes of thought and how the practice of astrology may be influenced by each one. For students, it is useful to define the various schools of astrological thought. For practitioners, it is important to understand the context and intellectual motivations behind our approach to astrology. Each astrological paradigm is valid in its own right and should be respected as being true to the larger paradigm that informs it. Taking a deconstructionist tact, we can acknowledge that for each astrologer, the paradigm under which they operate represents a guiding truth that is not more or less true than any other truth. That's it. Very interesting. Over the years, I've been a mishmash of almost all of those, but not so much the deterministic. It's funny because considering our species, that is very deterministic. I mean, if our consciousness as a species had risen to a particular point of over and above our hubris for ourselves and thinking we were so smart and so wise, which we're not, we could have come to terms with our limits and understood the earth wasn't just here for us, you know? The sun changed, and oh my God, look at that. Oh boy. Okay. So, anyway, yeah, our species, you know, you might want to write this term down. I probably said it before, but if you haven't watched before, the maximum power principle states, I'm paraphrasing here, that any one species will use whatever it can find for energy in order to survive and use it as much as it can until it's gone. And basically that's what we've done. So our consciousness hasn't been all that high because even though some people in our species were aware of this, it's just too hard to get most people to understand it. And then, so if you use the scientific astrology about reality, the physical limits that we live within, you're going to realize that our time is short. Our time is not permanent here. Then if you go by, say, the New Age, which I've generally thought of most of the time too when I'm doing somebody's chart, you want to take the difficult aspects and the difficult positions and help them rise above the negative expression and learn how to bring it to a positive expression. I've talked about this plenty of times. Most of us fall in the middle of the continuum for each position or planet aspect or whatever. And as if you look at our species, we had our chances to transform, but we've changed the physical world so much that it's feeding on itself. All the negatives are feeding on themselves. You have methane coming out everywhere. You have our carbon sinks that used to suck in the CO2, the Amazon, the oceans, our trees. You have them falling by the wayside. At some point, when the ocean has been saturated with CO2, to the point that it can't really absorb without being super acidic, it's already more acidic. than it should be. That's why the coral reefs are having so much trouble and why shellfish can't make their shells. Um, so, and then the reincarnation part, well, with the metaphysical part, you know, anybody that wants to can use that. You know, you can't prove a negative. You can't prove it's not there, right? So there's that. I mean, over the years, when I was much younger, I really kind of like thought the reincarnation aspect of things was really interesting, and I used to read a lot about it. But it's got its relevance, I guess. But I just cannot find or buy into why a 5-year-old is born into a war zone, or a baby's born into a war zone. I mean, what could the baby have done in the past? I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right, to me. But there could be certain aspects of reincarnation that we can apply. I don't know. But I really like the whole study of quantum physics. I don't know much about it, but it does really bring up uh, interesting points about our individual lives and about our species. Our ancestors were very successful, or we would not be here. If they failed 30,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago, we wouldn't be here. Okay, they were very smart and somewhat wise. But over time, I mean, once they adopted agriculture, and if you learn to read about this, the beginnings of agriculture, small, tiny subsistence, a woman digging in the ground with a stick and putting a seed in there, it's like when you start to learn about anthropology and the beginnings of our starting to become civilized, and you compare and learn the processes we've gone through, it really helps you understand where we are now and where we aren't. We're not grasping. As a species, we're not grasping. There are particular people, but very few people can get it. Now, see, the big issue is it doesn't matter if you understand where we are, because we're so locked into this system that we've made that keeps us dependent on something that's destructive. We have to live, and we use this industrialized system, but it's so destructive that down the road it's going to kill us anyway. So I was going to read something out of Overshoot. Maybe I'll do that next time. There was just a little bit in the very beginning, and I thought it was so interesting that I landed on this part because it does talk about paradigms. I'll just read the beginning. Facing the future wisely. Perilously persistent cargoism. And cargoism is delusion that technology will always save us from whatever, okay? From our demise, from our failure. It is essential to see the profound peril in continued flagrant misperception of the very nature of the human situation. The peril compelled me to write this book. Misperception is the problem to be overcome by a paradigm shift, and only a paradigm shift can overcome it. Misperception will tend to motivate efforts to pursue ostensible solutions that will, when the circumstances are so much different from what people suppose them to be, make matters worse instead of better. In this concluding chapter, therefore, I want to highlight the contrast between prevalent presuppositions about our situation and about our options, and the actual ecological circumstances that need to be recognized and with which we must do our best to cope. Okay, that'll be for next time. But that's really what we're really covering here mostly is the paradigms that humans experience. So with Pluto and Aquarius, I'm not going to say it means humans have to change or else. There's already an else. But what can we... There's one small slim thing. If the nuclear power plant's melting down doesn't do us all in and deform us to the point where who would want to be alive, once we get a good many decades into the century, if there's a few 100,000 people that live in different parts of the world, what can they take with them? What can we have learned and communicated throughout the decades as to what is a better paradigm for humans to live through or to live by? Expectations less than what humans have been doing. We've been too attached to, oh, let me make my life comfortable. You know, how the furniture. I mean, I know this seems silly, but it's not. We have massive amounts of producing cozy, fancy furniture. When somebody gets done with one, they just throw it out. Well, they might give it to Salvation Army or something, but still, there's too much of this. I'm human and I need to live a certain way, and it has to be really super fantastic. Okay, so you've heard me go on about that spiel before. We really have to, and it's not just paring down, and like some people still think that we just have to pare around the edges. And I talk about how I buy for decades now. I've almost always bought my clothes secondhand, etc., and different things we do to minimize our individual impact. But when you've got governments that are doing what they're doing and pushing for the growth paradigm, it's not going to matter. But as the collapse continues, I'm hoping that, certain people, if they manage to make it through, I have 2 grandsons. Uh, I might have said this before, but when my 8-year-old grandson was like 3.5, we were taking a little walk by the cornfield. They lived on a side dirt road. And I was gently trying to bring up certain things, because if you don't teach them when they're young, you don't have to say the world's coming to an end, but if you don't teach them certain things, their mindset is already conditioned by the broader culture. So I was saying something about cars putting the gases in the atmosphere that are not healthy or something. And I might have said a little bit more. And he goes, but if we don't have a car, if we can't use cars, how are we going to get around? He said that. He said that. 3.5. How are we going to get around? He puts his hands up because that's what he does. It was so cute. But yeah, that's just it. Humans, we think we have to get around. We have to go here. We have to go there. And we've set up our civilization so you have to. You have to go to the store to get groceries. I live in a rural area. If I don't have a car, I can't walk 15 miles to go get groceries. So yeah, we need to figure this out. We need to at least try to do as little damage as on the way out. This is the way to put it. We need to do as little damage on the way out as we can. So, but does that mean, mining for rare earth minerals and continuing to drill for oil? No. It means changing our values and our expectations. And therefore, once we do that on a very deep level, we can come up with the physical changes we need to make. Okay, that's good for today. And all sunny and so thank you for watching, and see you next time on Astrologer Climate Witness. Goodbye.